Well, hello and welcome. It is great to be here with you today. This is going to be a video series on the French Revolution and Napoleon. This will actually be an 11 video series, and this is the first of those 11 videos. In the series itself, we'll walk through the reasons for the French Revolution and just go through step by step all the changes that took place, both for good and also for bad. And then that'll transition into the time when Napoleon came to power in France, and we'll walk through his time in power, trying to bring about order to a disordered place on through his eventual downfall. So I hope you enjoy the videos. I hope that you find them informative and helpful. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, well, we'll get started today is to talk about the old regime. The first thing that we're going to get into with this topic of the French Revolution is to take a look at how French society was organized. Because there end up being a number of factors involved with the French Revolution, but definitely an important one is how society was structured. So we'll walk through step by step and look at the different parts of French society. One thing to know as we go through these parts is that when it talks about France's three social classes, those classes were a little more strictly organized than what we might be familiar with in our society today here in America. You know, we're familiar with the idea of social classes, maybe hearing terms like upper class, lower class, middle class, working class, things like that. And those are distinctions probably made on income as much as anything, or at least perceived income. But as far as being born into one of those classes and staying there, one thing that we do have in our society, and it's not always easy, is mobility. Someone might be born into what might be identified as lower class and work their way up to upper class. Some people might start out in the upper class and work their way down. And many people may bounce around multiple times, both directions throughout their lifetime. But the key thing is we're accustomed to a certain degree of mobility. Whereas in France, these social classes were pretty distinct and defined, and there wasn't really a way to go from one to the other. So as we look at the social classes, you'll see that this is largely done with pictures. One thing to keep track of is the name of these different social groups in France, and I have a feeling you're going to be able to do that pretty effectively. They have the names of First Estate, Second Estate, and Third Estate. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Now, the First Estate is the first one that we'll talk about. If you look at the picture, you might be able to identify this as a church building. The First Estate in France was the Catholic Church. Now, hardly anybody relative to the total population of France, which was about 26 million people, actually fit within the First Estate. You had to be a part of the Catholic Church, and I'm not talking, a member of the church or somebody who went to church, but someone like a priest, cardinal, bishop, somebody that was a part of the structure of the church itself. Now, as far as what that meant, as far as power, how that fit in society, obviously a very small percentage of the population, less than 1% of the population actually was a part of this First Estate. But when it came to privileges and wealth, quite a bit was held by the First Estate. The church owned, at a minimum, about 10% of the land in France. When you look at different sources, the amount of land ownership is described a little differently, but just know that at a minimum, 10% of the land was owned by the church. That represents a certain degree of power and wealth. And then when it came to taxation in France, and this will become an important issue, the church was exempt from paying taxes. Now, that's not an out of the ordinary thing. We're accustomed to churches in America being tax exempt. So as far as out of the ordinary, not strange to us. But in terms of the financial difficulties that France will find itself in the late 1700s, it will become important that one wealthy component of French society did not have the burden of taxes to pay. Now, the next social category in France, quite simply, is called the Second Estate. And if you look at the picture there, you might see a couple of people dressed in a very fancy way. That's meant to be representative of the French nobility. Now, like the First Estate, the Second Estate represented a very small percentage of France's overall population. Only about 2% of the people of France fit into this second estate. This was basically all about the family that you were a part of. And much like the first estate, even though the population percentage of the population was quite small, the land ownership was quite high. At a minimum, probably 20 to 30% of the land was held by these noble families. And then when it came to privileges or obligations, the second estate was very privileged, much like the first estate. When it came to paying taxes, rarely, if ever, were members of the second estate required to pay taxes. And again, considering the financial circumstances of France getting into the late 1700s, this will become an important issue. Now, the final social category for France was called the third estate, and this simply represented everybody else in France. If you weren't a part of the first or the second estate, you were lumped into the third estate. And the picture on the screen represents a political cartoon from the time where each of the three estates are represented. And when you look at it, you can probably guess that the person hunched over carrying the other two is representative of the third estate, because in essence, the burdens of France were resting on the backs and shoulders of the members of the third estate. Now, when it came to taxation, this is where the tax money came from. And of course, there's a certain degree of logic there. If this represents the vast majority of people in France, it would make sense if the majority of taxes came from them. But many of these people had very limited resources. And so even with lots of people contributing, the amount might still remain fairly small. Now, with the third estate being as large as it was, it is important to go ahead and break it into some subcategories because everyone was not equal throughout the third estate. So breaking down the third estate a little bit more, one subcategory within the third estate was the bourgeoisie. And these were basically your bankers, your factory owners, your merchants, your skilled workers. Many of the people that made up the bourgeoisie were highly educated people. And one thing in particular, a lot of them were familiar with were Enlightenment ideas. These were some of the richest people in France. So one thing I want to make sure you understand or don't get confused about is third estate did not equal poor necessarily. Some of the richest people in all of France were a part of the third estate. The reason that they didn't have privileges and weren't seen of like the nobility is they just weren't from a noble family. So what you had in the bourgeoisie is you had some really, really rich people. You had some highly, highly educated people, and then people then that were paying taxes, people that didn't really have privileges, especially compared to the second estate, and that was frustrating to them. So it's not surprising that many of the people who really pushed for change in France were a part of this bourgeoisie group. They had the wealth, they had the knowledge, but they didn't have the privileges. A second subcategory within the third estate is called the sans-culottes. These represent the working class, and the name itself basically means wearing pants. It was more common for the upper classes to wear basically short pants or culottes, and so the working class people, they wore full-length pants, is basically what that comes down to. And these were people that had generally pretty low-paying jobs, often kind of going from job to job, not necessarily finding steady work, very much on the edge of being in big, big trouble financially. Also, tax burden and all the things that came with being a part of the third estate. So this was another group that definitely felt they had something to gain if some things could change in France. Now, the third subgroup within the third estate that represented the vast majority of the population of France was a category of peasant. France's population at this time was about 26 million people. About 80% of France's population could be categorized as peasants. So about a little more than 22 million of the 26 million people in France were in this category. And for these people, roughly half of whatever they could earn doing whatever it was they could find to do went in the form of paying taxes, went in the form of tithing to the church. And what they got in return was pretty much a life of relative misery, a life of relative uncertainty, basically just hoping to get through one day to the next with very little opportunity for anything else. So when you just look at the social categories of France, you can see that even if everything else was going fine in France, that there would be people who desired to see a different structure to how things worked. as we get into the next couple of videos, we'll start talking more specifically about some of the actual problems that France was facing, and that'll get us that much closer to revolution breaking out in France. So thanks for joining me today. I hope you found the video helpful and informative on the social categories in France, and I hope you'll join me for the next video in the series. Thanks for watching.